The desert didn't believe in grand finales. It preferred to let things wither. The sky was the color of old steel, and the heat pressed down on the land like a heavy hand, squeezing the life from every living thing until even the wind seemed too tired to move. Noose walked. For 3 days, the only sounds had been the rasp of his own breath and the crunch of his boots on the dry creek bed. The only smell was the ghost of rabbit blood on his fingers. He was a man made of silence, a silhouette moving through a landscape that had forgotten how to speak. He hadn't answered the man at the trading post, the one who'd laughed too loud and asked if his kind still slept with tomahawks under their pillows. The question had hung in the air, thick and ugly, and Noose had just turned and walked away, leaving the man's laughter to choke on its own ignorance. He walked for 3 days, letting the silence of the desert wash the stain away. He was almost home, the familiar shape of the broken mesa rising in the distance, when he saw it. It was wrong. Everything in the desert was gnarled, twisted, or broken. Things were bleached by the sun and scoured by the wind. Nothing was neat. But there, at the base of a skeletal mesquite tree, was a burlap sack. It was tied shut at the top with a tight, cruel-looking knot. It was placed too carefully, too deliberately. It didn't belong. His first instinct was to keep walking. It was not his business. This land was full of things left behind: rusted pans, broken wagons, the bones of forgotten sorrows. This was just one more. He walked past it, his shadow stretching long and thin behind him. He took 10 steps, 20. But the silence he was walking into felt different now. It had a new shape, a heaviness. He stopped. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, the ancient warning that said something was watching. He slowly turned, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. The sack hadn't moved. The wind curled around it, lifting a fine red dust. It was just a sack, a piece of trash. He was about to turn away for good when he heard it. It wasn't a voice, not at first. It was a sound so small it was almost nothing. A faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage, or a heart. Noose's own heart went still. This wasn't trash. This was a trap. Someone had left it for him. The trader's laugh echoed in his ears. He scanned the ridgelines, the shadowed crevices in the rocks. He saw nothing. No movement, no glint of sun on a rifle barrel, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He drew his knife, the blade catching the dull light. He approached the sack slowly, circling it like a wolf. The thumping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying. He nudged the sack with the toe of his boot. It was soft, but there was a weight to it. A dead weight. He felt a cold dread creep into his gut. He was ready for anything. A snake, a rabid animal, a trick. He was not ready for the whisper that tore through the silence, thin and brittle as a dead leaf. "Please!" It was a child's voice. His blood ran cold. All thoughts of traps and enemies vanished, replaced by a horror so profound it almost buckled his knees. He knelt, the red dirt staining his trousers. His fingers, calloused and scarred, fumbled with the twine knot. It was pulled impossibly tight, meant to be permanent. He didn't bother untying it. He sliced through it with one clean stroke of his knife. The burlap fell away, and the world stopped. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her skin deathly pale beneath a thick coat of grime. Her hair, the color of dry straw, was matted and tangled with bits of leaf and dried blood at her temple. But it was her face that stole the breath from his lungs. Someone had drawn on her, with charcoal, or maybe something worse. 2 huge, ugly circles were drawn around her eyes, making her look like a hollow-eyed skull. Jagged lightning bolt lines ran down her cheeks, and on her forehead, stark and black, was a crudely drawn cross. It wasn't a child's game. It was a brand, a defilement. It was a mark meant to declare her as something broken, something to be thrown away. Her eyes opened. They were the color of new spring leaves, a shocking splash of life in her dust-caked face. They were dulled with dehydration and terror, but they were steady. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked up at the towering, silent man who was his shadow and whispered again, her voice a dry rasp. "Please, take them off." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second. She flinched, not in fear, but in anticipation of a blow that had clearly fallen many times before. The sight of it sent a hot, white rage through him, a rage he hadn't felt in years. He forced his hand to be gentle. His thumb moved across her cheek, trying to wipe away the black stain. It didn't smudge. It was caked on, mixed with something greasy and vile that clung to her skin. Whoever did this meant for it to stay. Without a word, he shrugged off his deerskin coat and wrapped her in it. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of sharp bones in quiet misery. Her ribs pressed against his arm. As he stood up, she pressed her face into his chest and let out a single, shuddering sigh. "I thought I died," she whispered. He started the long walk home, her small weight a terrible burden in his arms. He didn't look back at the empty sack. He didn't scan the ridges for enemies anymore. The enemy was no longer hiding. They had shown their face on the skin of this child. And as he walked, a promise formed in the silent chambers of his heart. It was a promise as hard and unforgiving as the desert itself. He would find them, and he would make them pay. The cabin was more a part of the earth than a structure built upon it. It was a half-dugout, nestled under the protective lip of a rock outcropping, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It was a shelter built for survival, not comfort. He carried her inside, the familiar scent of cedar smoke and dried herbs wrapping around them. He laid her gently on the thick buffalo hide he used for a bed, the only soft thing in the entire place. Her eyes darted around the small, dim space, taking in the shelves of clay pots filled with remedies, the stone hearth, the single wooden chair. She looked like a frightened fawn, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. He moved slowly, deliberately, pouring clean water from an earthen jug into a clay cup. He knelt and held it out to her. She stared at the cup for a long moment, as if trying to remember what it was for. Then, her small, chapped lips parted, and she drank. She drank with a desperate, frantic thirst, like someone who had been punished for the very act of wanting. When the cup was empty, she handed it back, her eyes dropping to the floor. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire he'd stirred back to life. Are you going to give me back?" she asked, her voice so small it was almost swallowed by the room. He didn't answer. He couldn't. What could he say? He didn't know who they were, or what he was going to do. He just turned and added some dried meat and roots to the stew pot hanging over the fire. An hour later, he placed a piece of cornbread on a wooden plate and set it before her. She stared at it. Her hand reached out, her fingers hovering over the crust. Then she froze, her whole body tensing as if waiting for a slap. The gesture spoke volumes. It told a story of hunger and cruelty, of every natural impulse being met with violence. He watched from the corner of his eye, his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. He said nothing. Finally, she snatched the bread and held it close, cradling it like a precious treasure. She took a tiny bite, then another. Her eyes kept flickering toward him, studying his face. She took in his high cheekbones, the long black hair tied back with a simple leather thong, the old scar that ran along his jaw like a crack in granite. She wasn't looking at him with fear anymore. She was looking with a desperate, uncertain curiosity. "Mama said the good ones don't talk too much," she murmured, almost to herself. She took another bite of cornbread. "Said they just stay." That night, she fell asleep by the fire, curled up inside his deerskin coat like a lost puppy that had finally found a safe corner of the world. She didn't dream, or if she did, she made no sound. Noose sat awake for a long time, watching her. The rage in his chest had cooled to a hard, dense core of purpose. He picked up a piece of cedar wood and his carving knife. His hands moved without thought, the blade peeling away thin curls of wood. He'd seen terrible things in his life. He'd seen the aftermath of raids, the hollow eyes of children who had lost everything. He'd seen the casual cruelty of men who called him a savage while acting with a barbarism he could never comprehend. But this was different. To leave a child in a sack, marked and discarded like refuse, it was a special kind of evil, an evil that couldn't be allowed to fester in the world. The shape of a small horse began to emerge from the wood in his hands. He carved through the night, the simple creative act a balm against the storm inside him. He was shaping something small and gentle, a counterpoint to the ugliness that had been done to her. Just before dawn, she stirred. Her eyes opened in the dark, finding him in the faint glow of the embers. "Did you ever have a name?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. He paused his carving, the knife still. The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. A name was a story, a history, a connection to a people. His had been taken from him, piece by piece, by treaties and laws and the slow, grinding erosion of his world. "Yes," he finally answered, his voice rough. "Once." She nodded, as if that was all the answer she needed. She closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. But Noose stayed awake, staring into the dying fire. The child had a name, she would tell him later, Ellie Mae. But she had been stripped of it, rebranded by hate. He had found her, but now he was just as lost. He should take her to the town, find the sheriff, a doctor, some woman with softer hands and a kinder heart. But as he looked at her sleeping form, the tiny cedar horse resting on the floor beside his hand, a part of him he thought was long dead and buried, stirred to life. It was a fierce, protective instinct that tightened its grip around his heart. He couldn't give her up, not now, not to a world that had thrown her away. He was a man who had lost his tribe, his name, his past, and now, a small girl with haunted eyes and a branded face had washed up on the shores of his solitude. He didn't know it yet, but he was no longer alone, and he would not let her be alone ever again. The morning light was thin and watery. He bathed her wounds with warm water infused with yarrow leaves to ward off infection. She winced when the cloth touched the raw scrape on her temple, but she didn't cry. Her pain was a silent, stoic thing. As he gently dabbed at the black marks on her face, trying to dissolve the greasy tar, she spoke in a whisper. "They said the devil marked me." Noose paused, the cloth held motionless against her cheek. "Who said that?" "Grandma," she answered, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Grandma drew it. She said no one would want me now." The black smudge on his fingers suddenly felt colder than ice. A grandmother. Her own blood. The cruelty of it was a physical blow. He felt the rage stir again, hot and sharp. He set his jaw and continued cleaning her face, his touch as gentle as he could make it. He would not let his anger frighten her. Her name, she told him, was Ellie Mae. Her mother's name was Greta. When he asked where her mother was, Ellie Mae's face clouded over. She didn't know. "She cried," Ellie whispered, her gaze distant. "The last time I saw her, she was crying. She told me not to scream when they put me in the sack. She said it would be better if I stayed quiet." He didn't have to ask who they were. It was the grandmother. But the way Ellie said it, there was a hesitation, a shadow of someone else in the memory. He didn't press. Instead, he stood up and walked to the doorway of the cabin, staring out at the horizon. In the far distance, a thin plume of smoke curled into the sky. It was from the town, miles to the east. It was too far to hear its Sunday church bells, too far to hear its gossip, but it was close enough for its cruelty to travel. He knew one thing for certain. A grandmother doesn't just decide to leave her own flesh and blood for the coyotes without a reason. And a mother doesn't tell her child to be quiet in the face of such horror unless she is just as terrified. Something was deeply, horribly wrong in that town. Later that day, he watched her as she sat on the cabin steps, staring up at two hawks circling high overhead. "What are they saying?" she asked. "They don't speak our tongue," he replied, his voice gruff. She considered this for a moment. "Maybe they do," she said softly, "and we're just too loud to hear them." That night, as she slept with the little cedar horse tucked under her chin, he sat by the fire, his knife idle in his hand. The weight of his decision settled on him. He was a pariah, an outcast. The people in that town saw him as a relic, a ghost from a past they wanted to forget. To them, he was more savage than the wilderness he lived in. Taking her there would be like throwing a lamb into a wolf den. They would see him, a native man with a white child, and they would see only a kidnapper. They wouldn't see the marks on her face or the terror in her eyes. They would only see what their prejudice allowed them to see. He couldn't take her there, but he couldn't keep her here forever. He was trapped. And for the first time in a very long time, Noose didn't know what to do. The silence of his cabin was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the unspoken questions of a little girl and the growing certainty that a storm was coming, and it was heading straight for them. The church bell in the town of Redemption rang with a sharp, judgmental clang. Below the white steeple, the good folk fanned themselves with prayer books, their faces pious masks hiding whispers of scandal. The subject of the day wasn't salvation, it was salvation's opposite. It was about the lost lamb, Ellie Mae Huxley. "She's gone," Dora Huxley announced, her voice trembling with a carefully rehearsed grief. She stood on the church steps, a pillar of sorrow in her best black dress. Her husband, Clem, a man whose face was a roadmap of weak decisions, stood beside her, looking grim and important. "Stolen! Snatched from her own yard by that Apache!" A collective gasp fluttered through the crowd, mouths fell open. Sheriff Blaylock, a man who wore his weariness like a second skin, folded his arms across his chest. He knew the Huxleys. He knew their land, their money, and their carefully constructed illusion of virtue. He also knew their cruelty. He'd seen it in the way they treated their hired help, in the hard lines around Dora's mouth. But they were powerful. "Taken last night," Dora sobbed, though not a single tear fell. The sack she was playing with, gone. The fence cut, and tracks, big feet, barefoot, a savage's tracks, leading out towards the wastes. "A savage," someone in the crowd muttered, and the word spread like a disease. Savage. Sheriff Blaylock shifted his weight. He'd seen Noose a few times over the years, trading pelts. The man was quiet, kept to himself. He wasn't a killer, but a child was missing, and the town needed someone to blame. And there was no easier target than the man who lived outside their walls, the man who was a living reminder of a history they'd rather ignore. Miles away, in the quiet solitude of the cabin, Noose had finally managed to wash the last of the black tar from Ellie's cheeks. The skin underneath was red and raw, but it was clean. The ghost of the marks remained, a faint, angry shadow. She held the unfinished cedar horse in her hands, running her thumb over its rough-hewn mane. It was the first thing anyone had ever made just for her. "I don't remember the last time I got to just sit," she said suddenly, watching a lizard scurry up the log wall. "Not without someone yelling that I was in the way." Noose didn't reply. He just slid a bowl of warm broth toward her. She took a careful sip. "Did you ever get locked in a closet?" He shook his head. "They put me in there when I spilled the milk," she said, her voice small. "Grandma said I needed to learn what silence felt like. She said my voice was like a stray dog barking." She managed a faint, watery smile. "Mama used to slip sugar cubes under the door when she thought Grandma wasn't looking." Noose's jaw tightened. The wind outside rattled a chime he'd made from hollowed bones, the sound like distant, chattering teeth. He thought of the plume of smoke from the town. He thought of the self-righteous faces he knew he would find there. Ellie pointed to a jar of dried herbs on his shelf. "What's that one for?" "Fever," he said. "And that one? Snake bite." Her voice dropped to a whisper. You got anything for shame? His hand stilled, the wooden spoon he was stirring the stew with hovering in midair. Steam rose between them like a veil. He looked at her, at this small wounded creature who had been taught to feel shame for simply existing. That one, he said, his voice low and heavy, takes time. That evening he watched as she stood over the water basin, her reflection staring back at her. She was scrubbing at her cheeks again, her small face screwed up in concentration, trying to erase the faint lines that still haunted her skin. She was rubbing so hard her skin was turning an angry red. He walked over and gently took the cloth from her hand. They're not on you, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. They're on them. She looked up at him, her green eyes searching his. They were so bright, so full of a light that no one had been able to extinguish. They said I was marked, she whispered. You were, he replied, his gaze unwavering. By hate, not by God. Back in town, Sheriff Blaylock had followed the tracks. They led from the Huxleys' back fence for about a half a mile, before vanishing into a rocky, impassable stretch of land near the creek. It was a dead end. Silas Yarrow, a sour-faced rancher who held a grudge against anything that wasn't white and Christian, rode up beside him. You think he took her to harm her? Silas spat, his voice full of righteous certainty. Blaylock hesitated. Don't know. Well, it don't look right, Silas pressed. Him, out there all alone. Then a sweet little girl goes missing. The whole town's talking. You gonna let that savage get away with it? You think the Huxleys are telling the whole truth? Blaylock asked quietly, more to himself than to Silas. Silas scoffed. It don't matter if they are or not. They're respectable folk. He's not. The logic was as twisted and ugly as the marks on Ellie's face, but it was the logic of redemption. Judgment bloomed like a noxious weed in that dry, unforgiving soil. On the third night, Noose laid out a second bedroll for her in the corner of the cabin. She looked at it, then at the spot by the fire where she'd been sleeping. Can I stay by the fire? She asked. Not 'cause I'm scared, she added quickly. Just 'cause it's warmer. He nodded. That night, she slept curled up in the deerskin coat again, the cedar horse held tight in her arms. The next morning, she woke to find him carving again. It wasn't another animal. This time, he was carving a face into a piece of cottonwood. It was a woman's face, with a strong jaw and watchful eyes. Is that me? She asked. No, he said. Who is it then? He didn't answer. He just kept carving. Later that day, Ellie was exploring the dusty patch of ground behind the chicken coop when she found something. It was a single hawk feather, its edges tipped with a coppery sheen. She ran to him, her face alight with a joy he hadn't seen before, holding it up like it was a piece of gold. Look! Do you think it's from one of the hawks I saw? He examined it closely. He knew the feathers of every bird in this desert. It was indeed from a red-tailed hawk. He nodded once. Then I'm keeping it, she declared, her voice full of a sudden, fierce purpose. For Mama, for when I see her again. That evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, she did something that made his heart ache. She knelt in the dirt near the cabin door and carefully buried the feather. She marked the spot with 3 small white stones. Mama used to say that God would find us, even in the dark, she whispered, her hands patting the earth. When she stood up, she reached out, and for the first time, she took his hand. Her fingers were small and warm, and they wrapped around his with an unspoken trust. He didn't pull away. He let her hold on as tight as she needed to. Meanwhile, back in Redemption, the web of lies was being woven thicker. Dora Huxley sat in her parlor, surrounded by the ladies of the church auxiliary, her fingers trembling dramatically as she poured tea. I warned my daughter, Greta, she said, her voice dripping with false piety. I told her she was birthing a curse. That child was never normal, always staring, making up stories, clinging to her mother like a barn rat. "I heard she had marks on her face," one of the women whispered, her eyes wide with morbid curiosity. Dora leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "She made them herself, with soot from the fireplace, drew them right on her own skin. The child is possessed, touched by the devil." The women gasped, their hands flying to their mouths. They nodded in grim agreement. In a town like Redemption, if you repeated a lie often enough, it didn't just become the truth. It became gospel. That night, Ellie asked him a question that hit him like a physical blow. "Why do you stay out here all alone?" He looked up from the fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. "People don't listen very well in town," he said. She thought about that for a moment, then added, in a voice wise beyond her years, "People don't see very well in town either." A quiet understanding passed between them, warm and solid. She leaned her small frame against his shoulder, a silent declaration of allegiance. He didn't move away. He let her stay. The next morning she woke up before him. When he came inside from checking his snares, he stopped dead in the doorway. She was standing in front of the small, polished piece of tin he used as a mirror. She had smeared wet blue clay on her face, in soft, swirling patterns over the faint, angry lines of her grandmother's marks. She saw him watching her in the reflection. "I thought," she said, her voice a little shaky, "I thought maybe if I put something new on, the old stuff wouldn't matter anymore." He walked over to her. He didn't say a word. He just reached out with his thumb and gently wiped one side of her face clean. Then he wiped the other. He handed her the mirror. She looked at her reflection, at her own unmarked skin, clean and flushed in the morning light. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "It's still me," she whispered. "But I'm not hiding now." He nodded. A hawk cried out high above the cabin, its shadow slicing across the yard like a silent promise. Ellie followed the shadow with her eyes, and a look of sudden, absolute certainty came over her face. "Mama's not dead," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. He didn't question her. He didn't ask how she knew. "She's somewhere dark," Ellie continued, turning to face him, her green eyes blazing. "I heard her crying when they tied the sack. I think she tried to stop them." Noose stood up, the full height of him seeming to fill the small cabin. The morning sun hit his face, and the scar on his jaw shone pale and white, like a dry riverbed. He looked at this little girl, this fierce, fragile survivor, and he knew that the time for hiding was over. The time for waiting was done. "I'll find her," he said. And it was not a promise. It was a vow. Ellie's lip trembled. You believe me?" He stepped forward and placed his hand gently over her heart. Then he moved his other hand to his own chest. "We don't lie from here," he said. As dusk fell that evening, she stood beside him at the edge of the mesa, looking out toward the distant, malevolent glow of the town. She clutched his arm, her small fingers digging into his sleeve. "You're not what they say you are," she whispered into the wind. He looked down at her, at the child who had been thrown away and marked for death, who had found her way back to the light. "Neither are you," he replied. And though neither of them smiled, the heavy silence that had defined his life bent and reshaped itself into something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like hope. The storm was coming, but now they would ride into it together. The morning mist rose from the desert floor like the ghosts of forgotten rivers. The world was soft, hazy, and quiet. Ellie was by the chicken coop, humming a tuneless little song as she scattered corn for the hens. Her bare feet curled in the cool, damp earth. The sound was a fragile, happy thing in the vast silence, a melody meant only for the wind and the birds. Noose crouched nearby, the soft scrape of his knife whittling a new handle for a broken bucket, the only other sound. This was their rhythm, a quiet ballet of shared tasks and comfortable silences. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what the presence of another human being felt like. He had expected it to be an intrusion, a violation of the solitude he had so carefully built around himself. Instead, it felt right. It felt like a missing piece of his own soul had been returned to him. "Did you always live alone?" she asked without turning around. He smoothed a rough edge of the wood with his thumb, considering the question. "For a long time," he finally said. "Longer than you've been alive." She nodded slowly. She didn't ask why anymore. She had come to understand that his silences weren't empty. They were full of things that words were too clumsy to hold. She came and sat beside him, her small knees drawn up to her chin, her face tilted up to catch the first warm rays of the sun. The raw, angry skin on her cheeks had finally begun to heal, but a faint discoloration, like a bruise deep beneath the surface, remained. She touched her cheek self-consciously. "You think it's ever going to go away for good?" He stopped his whittling and looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not the victim, but the survivor. The faint lines weren't a mark of shame anymore. They were a map of her journey. They were a testament to her strength. "Yes," he said, "but not just from the outside." She mulled that over. "Mama told me people get ugly when they're scared," she said. "Not just their faces, their hearts, too." She watched his strong, calloused hands working the wood. "Did anyone ever draw on you?" The question was so innocent, so direct. He paused, his knife still for a beat longer than usual. He thought of the taunts, the slurs, the treaties that had drawn lines all over his people's land, carving up their world, marking them as savages in their own homes. "Not with ink," he said, his voice low. She leaned her head against his arm, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke more than words ever could. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of his life. And he did not move. Later that day, they walked to the stream that trickled through the bottom of a narrow canyon. Ellie took off her battered boots and waded into the icy water. She let out a soft squeal but didn't jump out. Instead, she knelt and splashed the cold, clear water on her face, again and again. "I want it gone," she whispered, her voice fierce. "I don't want to look like a warning sign anymore." Noose knelt beside her. He had brought a soft cloth and a small clay pot. He unstoppered the pot, releasing the faint, sweet scent of marshmallow root that he had steeped in water overnight. He cupped the water in his palms and gently washed her face, rubbing the infused cloth over her cheeks. The herb was for soothing inflammation, for calming angry skin. It was an apology from the earth for the cruelty of man. She looked at her reflection in a still pool of water. The faint shadow was still there, but it was lighter, fainter. "It's better," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "It's a beginning," he replied. They sat on the grassy bank for a long time, letting her simple dress dry in the sun, listening to the buzz of dragonflies and the murmur of the stream. It was a peaceful moment, a small island of calm before the inevitable storm. That night, back in the cabin, Ellie began to create a space for herself. On the small, crude table he had built for her, she arranged her treasures. The cedar horse stood proudly in the center. Next to it, she lined up a collection of small, smooth stones, a shiny brass button she'd found, and a small, tarnished silver locket she had discovered under a loose floorboard. "Mama had a necklace like this," she said, holding the locket up to the firelight. "Except hers had a picture of me inside." He took the locket from her. The hinge was rusted shut. He tucked it into his pocket. He would open it for her later, when the time was right. She knelt by her bedroll, folding a spare rag into a makeshift pillow. "I think Mama's still somewhere near," she said, her voice growing drowsy. "I dream about her. I dream about her hands trying to untie the sack." She yawned, her small body finally succumbing to a day of peace and sunshine. "She called me her little bird," she murmured, her voice fading. "Said I had soft bones and a big heart. Said one day I'd be free." He watched her drift off to sleep, her breathing evening out into a soft rhythm. "You are free," he whispered to the sleeping child. A moment later, her eyes fluttered open again, as if she had heard him. They were clear and serious. "If I was yours," she asked slowly, deliberately, "would you still let me cry sometimes?" The question was a test, a plea. He looked at her, this child who had been taught that her tears were a nuisance, her voice an annoyance, her very presence a burden. "I would never stop you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't know he was capable of feeling. She gave a small, solemn nod, as if a contract had just been signed. "Then I'd be yours," she said. She closed her eyes and was asleep in seconds. The next morning, they walked deeper into the woods than they ever had before. He showed her which plants were medicine and which were poison. He showed her how to read the tracks of a deer, how to find water. She scrambled up onto a massive fallen log and declared herself the queen of the quiet. "Do you think Mama could have gotten away if she'd screamed louder?" she asked from her wooden throne. "No," Noose said, his voice flat. "Sometimes screaming just tells the cruel ones where to aim next." She was quiet for a long time after that, pondering his words. Then she asked, "Do people like the Huxleys ever stop hating?" "No," he said, looking toward the distant town. "But sometimes the world stops listening to them." That afternoon she did something remarkable. She took a piece of soft charcoal from the fire pit, and looking at her reflection in the water basin, she drew a new line on her own cheek. It wasn't the ugly, jagged mark of her grandmother. It was a soft, delicate swirl, like a gust of wind or a unfurling fern. She saw him watching her. "It's not to hide the old mark," she explained, her voice steady. "It's so this one belongs to me." He didn't reply, but that night, when she went to her bedroll, she found a small, polished mirror he had made from a piece of shiny tin resting on her pillow. In the town of Redemption, the poison was spreading. Sheriff Blaylock tried to calm the rising tide of fear and suspicion, but Silas Yarrow was relentless. He stood on the porch of the Mercantile, his voice a venomous drawl, painting a picture of a savage beast and a stolen child. "He's got that girl," Silas spat to a small crowd of onlookers, "and he's filling her head with his Apache lies." "What kind of lies?" asked the blacksmith, a thoughtful man who rarely spoke. "Lies that make her forget her own kind," Silas sneered. "Lies that make her forget her shame." The blacksmith paused, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "Maybe that ain't a lie, Silas," he said quietly. "Maybe that's a gift." Silas scowled, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Gossip traveled fast in a small town, but so did decency, even if it took a quieter path. Back at the homestead, Ellie had taken to gathering wildflowers and tucking them into the cracks of the fence posts. "It's for the ones who get hurt, but nobody ever sees," she explained. "I think flowers are like quiet people. You have to stop walking to even notice them." She snuck up behind Noose as he was fixing the well pump and tucked a bright yellow daisy behind his ear. "You got a face like a stone," she told him seriously, "but it doesn't scare me." He looked at her, at this impossible girl with dust on her dress and defiance in her heart, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Then you're stronger than most," he said. That evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, they stood together, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mesa. "You think we can find Mama?" she asked, her voice small again. He stared at the horizon, at the place where the light was dying. "If she's alive, we will find her." He didn't say what they would do if she wasn't. He didn't have to. She nodded. "Then I'll keep the feather safe, until I know for sure." Later, inside the cabin, she curled into her blanket, the cedar horse and the little mirror next to her. The carved face of the woman he was making sat on the windowsill, its wooden eyes watching over her. "You know what I think?" she said into the warm, fire-lit dark. "I think marks don't make people evil, but hiding them does. Hiding from what you've done. I think that's where the real bad starts." He gently tucked the blanket tighter around her shoulders, He didn't use words. He used presence. He used the steady, comforting weight of his protection. Outside, a storm was gathering on the far horizon. Thunder rolled, a faint, distant drumbeat. Ellie didn't flinch. The marks on her face, the ones put there by hate and the ones she had drawn herself, were gone. She was no longer a canvas for someone else's cruelty. She was herself. And somewhere out there, in the gathering dark, a reckoning was waiting. The sun rose weak and pale, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. A tense, brittle silence had fallen over the town of Redemption. Women hung their laundry with jerky, angry movements. Men stood in tight, whispering knots on street corners. Children were told in sharp, hushed tones to stay inside. Word had spread like a fever. He was coming. News didn't ride in like a warrior. He didn't carry a rifle or wear the paint of his ancestors. He just walked. His boots made a slow, deliberate rhythm on the packed dirt of the main road. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, hiding his eyes but not the grim set of his jaw. And beside him, walking with a barefooted confidence that defied the sharp stones and the hostile stares, was Ellie May. Her chin was lifted high. Her small fingers were curled into the worn deerskin of his coat. She no longer tried to hide her face. The faint, ghostly outlines of her grandmother's cruelty were still there, but they were no longer a brand of shame. They were a declaration of war. She walked through the center of the town that had discarded her like a torch that no amount of hatred could extinguish. The whispers started immediately, hissing from behind curtained windows and from the dark interiors of storefronts. "That's her? Is that the one? Look, the devil child. Why has he got her? That Apache. What's he doing? Where's the sheriff?" Noose didn't stop. He walked straight to the center of town and stopped in the dusty street directly in front of the sheriff's office. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The sudden, absolute silence that fell over the town was louder than any scream. Sheriff Blaylock stepped out onto the porch, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. He looked older than he had a few days ago, his face etched with a deep, troubled weariness. "I heard you found the Huxley girl," Blaylock said, his voice tight. Before Noose could speak, Ellie stepped forward. She planted her small, bare feet in the dust and looked the sheriff straight in the eye. "I wasn't lost," she said, her voice clear and ringing, carrying across the silent street. "I was thrown away." A sharp collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Blaylock blinked, taken aback by the fierce conviction in the child's voice. "Are you all right, child?" he asked, his tone softening. "She is not alone," Noose said, his voice low and resonant, a rumble of thunder before the storm. "But her mother is." At the mention of her daughter Greta, Dora Huxley shoved her way to the front of the crowd that was now gathering on the boardwalks. Her hair was perfectly pinned, her gloves a pristine white, but a frantic twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed the perfect facade of a grieving matriarch. "She doesn't know what she's saying," Dora cried, her voice high and shrill. "That man has confused her, stolen her, and filled her head with lies and wickedness." Ellie turned her gaze on her grandmother. The look in the child's eyes was ancient and unforgiving. "You put me in the sack," she said, her voice dropping to a cold, hard tone. "You drew on my face. You said I was the devil's badge." Dora staggered back as if she'd been struck. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "She is not lying," Noose said, his voice rising, commanding the attention of every person in that street. "And she says her mother is still alive." He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Clem Huxley, who was trying to hide behind his wife. "She says you have her, hidden, tied up. Now you will take us to her, or I will tear down every building on your land, piece by piece, until I find her myself." Clem Huxley blanched, sweat blooming on his forehead. "You're threatening decent, God-fearing folk," he stammered. "No," Noose said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I am ending what you started." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The entire town was frozen in a tableau of shock and disbelief. Then, Silas Yarrow, his face contorted with rage, cleared his throat. "This ain't your law, Apache. We settle our own affairs here." "You didn't settle this," Noose shot back, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "You buried it, just like you planned to bury her." Then Ellie's voice, small but sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the tension. "She's in the smokehouse." Every head turned to her. "I heard her," Ellie continued, her voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. "When they dragged me out, I heard her crying in the smokehouse. I remember the smell of the wood and the sound of the rats." No one laughed, no one scoffed. The raw, detailed truth of her memory was undeniable. Sheriff Blaylock's gaze shifted from Ellie to Dora's panicked face, to Clem's crumbling facade. Something in his spine, something that had been bent by public opinion and political pressure, finally snapped straight. "Take me there," the sheriff said to Clem, his voice leaving no room for argument. Dora's eyes flared with fury. "You'll listen to them? To a savage and accursed child over us?" "I'll listen to the child," Blaylock said quietly, his hand now resting firmly on the butt of his gun. "And today, the law is the law for everyone." It was not a posse that followed them down the dusty road to the Huxley estate. It was a silent, shamed procession. Half the town trailed behind, their faces a mixture of guilt, morbid curiosity, and a dawning horror. They walked past the neat white fences and the perfectly manicured rose bushes, toward the dark secret that festered at the heart of the most respected family in Redemption. Clem led the way, his steps faltering. Dora followed, her face a mask of pale, venomous rage, muttering scripture under her breath like a twisted prayer. Behind the main barn stood the smokehouse. The heavy wooden door was bolted shut from the outside with a thick iron bar. Blaylock didn't bother with the bolt. He drew back his foot and kicked the door with all his might. The wood splintered, the lock burst, and the door swung open into the darkness. The stench of stale air, fear, and human waste rolled out. And there, in the gloom, was Greta May. She was bound to a heavy wooden chair with thick, frayed ropes. A dirty cloth had been stuffed in her mouth as a gag. Her eyes were wide and wild with terror. Her skin was pale and translucent, and her hands shook uncontrollably from days of hunger and dehydration. "Mama!" Ellie screamed, the sound ripping from her throat. She ran into the darkness, clawing at the gag, at the ropes binding her mother's arms. Noose was right behind her. His knife flashed in the dim light, slicing through the ropes with a single clean stroke. Greta slumped forward, a broken, sobbing wreck, and Noose caught her before she could hit the floor. Greta wept, not from pain, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of hearing her daughter's voice. "Ellie," she choked out, her own voice a raw, unused croak. I thought they'd killed you. I thought I'd never see you again." "You didn't," Ellie whispered, her face buried in her mother's tangled hair. "He found me. The tall one found me." Greta looked up, her tear-filled eyes finding Noose in the shadows. Her mouth opened, trying to form the words of thanks, but only a choked sob came out. He just nodded once. It was enough. Outside, the crowd had gone dead silent. The truth was laid bare in all its ugly, horrifying reality. Sheriff Blaylock turned to Clem and Dora Huxley. "You tied up your own daughter," he said, his voice shaking with a rage he could no longer contain. "And you left a child in the desert to die. For God's sake, why?" Dora opened her mouth to spit another lie, another denial. But this time, no words came. There was nothing left but the vast, ugly emptiness where her soul should have been. "You said we were the curse," Ellie said, her voice clear and strong as she helped her mother to her feet. "But you were wrong. The curse was you. All along, it was you." The townspeople didn't cheer. They didn't shout for justice. They just parted, clearing a path as Noose gently helped the frail Greta walk out of her prison, with Ellie clinging tightly to her other arm. They moved like a strange, holy procession, a family forged in the crucible of unimaginable cruelty. And as they walked away, the rest of the town was left behind to choke on the bitter taste of their own silence. They had looked away for too long, and now they could never unsee what they had seen. The sky bloomed with the soft colors of a new day, apricot and rose spilling over the sharp edges of the mesa. A new kind of quiet had settled over the cabin. It wasn't the silence of loneliness or fear. It was the deep, restorative hush of healing. Ellie stood on the small porch, her bare feet planted firmly on the wooden planks. The morning was cool, and the tin cup of warm herbal tea she held sent steam spiraling into the air. Her face was clean. The last shadows of the marks had faded into memory. She had stood in front of the little tin mirror that morning, tracing the lines of her own cheeks, and had whispered to her reflection, "It's mine again." Inside, her mother, Greta, slept by the hearth. Color was slowly returning to her cheeks, and the haunted look in her eyes had begun to recede. Sleep no longer seemed a place of terror for her, but one of refuge. Sometimes in the middle of the day she would start humming old, half-forgotten lullabies, stitching the broken pieces of their world back together with threads of melody. Noose was by the chicken coop, scattering feed. He moved with the same deliberate, silent grace he always had, but the rigid tension in his shoulders was gone. He looked like a man who was no longer bracing for a blow. Ellie had started calling him our tall one. It wasn't father, and it wasn't Mr. It was something else, something that fit him perfectly. Greta appeared in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She watched Ellie and Noose, a small, peaceful smile on her lips. They didn't speak much in these early hours. Their language was one of shared glances and quiet gestures. They were three shipwreck survivors who had washed up on the same shore, learning to build a new life from the wreckage. "Did she sleep well?" Noose asked, his voice a low rumble. Greta nodded. "The best she has in months. No nightmares." That was all that needed to be said. By noon, Ellie was down by the stream, painting stones with berry juice. She laid them in a neat line leading from the water's edge back toward the cabin. "It's so Mama always knows the way home," she explained to a curious squirrel, "even if she forgets again." Each stone was decorated with its own unique mark: swirls, suns, and stars. She wasn't covering anything up anymore. She was just adding her own light to the world. Later they gathered firewood together. Greta, who a week ago could barely stand, now insisted on carrying the lighter bundles. "I will not be a ghost in my own life anymore," she had told Noose, her voice full of a newfound resolve. He had not argued. That evening, as the sun began to set, a wagon appeared on the path leading to the cabin. It was Sheriff Blaylock, and he was alone. He rode slowly, his hat in his hands, looking not like an officer of the law, but like a man on a pilgrimage. Noose stepped out to meet him, with Ellie and Greta watching from the doorway. Blaylock dismounted with a heavy sigh. "The town is quieter now," he said, not looking at Noose, but at the ground. "Folks don't know what to say. They don't know how to face what they allowed to happen." "They don't have to face me," Noose said. "They just have to stop turning away from what's right in front of them." Blaylock nodded. "Dora and Clem are gone. Slipped out on the midnight stagecoach west, left the house, the land, everything." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Greta's. "They say shame is a heavy thing to carry." Greta stepped forward, her posture straight and strong. "I don't need apologies from this town, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But I will not be quiet anymore, and neither will my daughter." "No one's asking you to be," Blaylock replied. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "There's a piece of land south of town, good soil with a spring. It was never claimed. If you all want it, it's yours. No strings. A fresh start." Greta looked at Noose. His face was impassive, but his eyes were clear. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you, Sheriff," Greta said. "We accept." Blaylock seemed relieved. He turned to go, then stopped. "One more thing. The school teacher." She asked about Ellie. At the mention of school, Ellie stepped out from behind her mother. I can go? She asked, her eyes wide. Blaylock looked at the little girl, at the face that was once a canvas for cruelty, now glowing in the golden light of dusk. If you want to, child, he said gently. No one will stop you this time. Ellie turned to Noose, her face full of a hopeful, tremulous question. Will you walk with me on the first day? He knelt down, so his eyes were level with hers. Every day, he said. The sheriff tipped his hat, climbed back onto his wagon, and rode away, leaving behind a silence filled not with ghosts, but with possibilities. That night, the sky was a vast, deep velvet, strewn with 1,000,000 glittering stars. Noose sat outside by the fire, carving again. The piece of wood in his hand was smooth, pale cottonwood. He wasn't carving an animal or a face. He was making a cradle. Greta came and sat beside him, pulling her blanket tight against the night chill. For Ellie's dolls? She asked softly. He looked up from his work, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For what comes next, he said. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm and soft against his rough, calloused skin. They didn't tremble. They were steady. I never thought I would live past the shame, she whispered. You didn't, he said, his voice gentle. You outlived it. A quiet moment passed between them, a shared breath under the vast, silent sky. Then she took his hand and gently, tenderly, laid it over her own belly. It took him a moment to understand. His mind, so accustomed to violence and survival, struggled to grasp the simple, miraculous message. When he finally did, he closed his eyes, a wave of profound, unexpected emotion washing over him. The farmhand she had loved, the man murdered by her parents' hate, had left a part of himself behind. This wasn't just a new life. It was a continuation. It was a victory. Inside the cabin, Ellie was fast asleep, her arms wrapped tightly around the cedar horse, the little horse that smelled of safety and the wild woods. The fire crackled, a warm, steady heartbeat in the center of their new world. Once, she had been a thing to be thrown away, marked as rotten and worthless. Now, she was the cornerstone of a family. The burlap sack hadn't been her end. It had been her beginning. It had led her from the darkness of hatred to the one soul on earth who would see the light in her and who would never, ever look away. If you've been moved by this story of survival, justice, and the power of an unlikely family, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that even in the deepest darkness, a single flicker of hope can light the way home.